The ISS Sparrow drifted through space, a slow and unimpressive dot against the vast darkness. Among the human fleet, it was known as the weakest, slowest, and most useless ship ever built. The crew had heard all the jokes. Other captains called it a rusty bucket, a flying coffin, and worst of all, the ship that should have been scrapped. Even the Sparrow's own engineers doubted its worth. In every battle, the Sparrow was ordered to stay in the back, far from real combat. Its weapons were outdated, its shields were weak, and its engines barely held together. While other ships in the fleet boasted powerful cannons and cutting-edge technology, the Sparrow had nothing special. It was slow, it was fragile, and it was forgotten. Captain Reynolds stood on the bridge, listening to the distant chatter from the fleet's communication channels. He could hear the subtle laughter from other crews. They didn't expect much from the Sparrow. They never did. He ignored them, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the glowing screen in front of him. A new war was coming, and he had no time for insults. The human fleet was preparing for battle against the Vornax Empire, a ruthless alien race that had crushed countless civilizations. The Vornax ships were larger, stronger, and armed with weapons far beyond human technology. The fleet's admirals had already made a decision. The Sparrow would be sent ahead as a scout, a mission that sounded harmless, but everyone knew the truth. It was a death sentence. Reynolds tapped his fingers on the control panel, his expression unreadable. The mission was perfect. The admirals thought they were sending the weakest ship to be sacrificed, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what he and his crew had done in secret. Deep inside the ship, hidden from prying eyes, a team of engineers worked in silence. They had spent months modifying the Sparrow, adding secret upgrades that no one outside the crew knew about. Its rusty exterior remained the same, but beneath the surface, it was no longer the ship everyone mocked. One of the engineers, Lieutenant Harris, wiped sweat from his forehead as he double-checked a hidden console. The ship's energy signature was disguised, making it appear weak to enemy sensors. The new stealth system was untested, but if it worked, the Sparrow would be able to disappear from enemy radars. Beside him, another crew member, Lieutenant Vega, worked on the ship's most important upgrade, an experimental AI designed for rapid combat adaptation. It wasn't fully operational yet, but if activated, it could turn the Sparrow into something deadly. Harris glanced at Vega. "Do you think this will work?" Vega smirked. "We don't have a choice." In the command room, Reynolds received the final orders from the fleet. His mission was simple: fly ahead, gather information on the enemy, and, if possible, cause a distraction. They didn't expect him to survive. He smiled to himself. The fleet thought they were sending a weak, useless ship to its doom, but they had no idea what the Sparrow had become. The enemy would learn soon enough. The ISS Sparrow moved silently through the darkness of space, its engines humming at a low frequency. From the outside, it still looked like the weakest ship in the fleet, slow, outdated, and completely unremarkable. But inside, the crew worked tirelessly, preparing for the battle ahead. Captain Reynolds stood on the bridge, his hands resting on the control panel as he stared at the distant stars. His face remained calm, but his mind was racing. He knew the fleet had sent them on a suicide mission, but he also knew something the admirals did not. The Sparrow was no longer the weak, useless ship they thought it was. It had become something else, something far more dangerous. Deep in the lower decks, Lieutenant Harris and Lieutenant Vega ran final checks on the ship's hidden modifications. The AI system, codenamed Phantom, was nearly ready for activation. It was designed to learn and adapt in real time, making the Sparrow faster, smarter, and deadlier than anything the enemy had faced before. Harris wiped sweat from his brow as he checked the energy readings. "Power levels are stable. We can activate Phantom whenever the captain gives the order." Vega nodded, tapping a series of commands into her console. "Good, but once we activate it, there's no turning back. The system is untested. If it fails, we'll be completely exposed." Harris sighed. "We don't have a choice. The fleet sent us to die. Either we use this, or we go down without a fight." Meanwhile, the enemy fleet loomed in the distance. The Vornax warships were massive, their sleek black hulls reflecting the light of a distant star. Their commander, Lord Zyros, watched from his flagship, his sharp crimson eyes locked onto the incoming human vessels. He barely paid attention to the Sparrow. It was weak, insignificant. "Destroy the scouting ship," he ordered, his voice cold and emotionless. Within seconds, a barrage of energy beams shot through space, heading straight for the Sparrow. "Shields up," Reynolds barked. The crew scrambled, their fingers dancing over control panels as they tried to reinforce the ship's weak defenses. But they all knew the truth. If they took a direct hit, the shields wouldn't hold. "Activating Phantom," Vega shouted. For a split second, everything on the ship flickered. The lights dimmed, the engines hummed at a lower frequency, and then the Sparrow vanished. Not just visually, but from every enemy sensor. To the Vornax fleet, it was as if the human ship had never existed. Their weapons fired into empty space, missing their target completely. On the bridge of the Sparrow, Reynolds exhaled. It worked. They had just become invisible. The enemy fleet hesitated. Lord Zyros narrowed his eyes, his hands clenching into fists. Where did it go? The answer came almost immediately. A Vornax destroyer, one of the smaller warships in the fleet, exploded from within. The Sparrow had moved undetected through the enemy formation and launched a precision strike at the ship's weakest point. The enemy fleet panicked. The humans had never possessed technology like this before. How had a weak, useless ship just taken out one of their own? Reynolds grinned. The battle had only just begun. The Vornax fleet was in chaos. Just moments ago, they had been confident, certain of an easy victory. Now they were scrambling to understand what had happened. One of their destroyers had exploded from within, torn apart by a ship they couldn't even see. The Sparrow had vanished from their sensors, slipping through their fleet like a ghost. On the bridge of his flagship, Lord Zyros paced, his sharp claws clicking against the metal floor. His crimson eyes burned with frustration as he watched his fleet struggle to make sense of the battle. How had the humans done this? The Sparrow was supposed to be the weakest ship in their fleet, a pathetic relic, and yet it had just destroyed one of his warships with terrifying precision. "Find them," he growled. "No human ship can simply disappear." His officers worked feverishly, scanning the battlefield for any trace of the missing ship. But there was nothing. No energy readings, no movement, no sign that the Sparrow had ever been there. The enemy was hunting a ghost. Meanwhile, the Sparrow weaved through the enemy formation, hidden in the darkness of space. Inside the ship, the crew was silent, their breaths held as they watched their captain for orders. Reynolds stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of him. The AI system Phantom was working perfectly, keeping them invisible to enemy sensors. The Vornax had no idea where they were, and that gave them a massive advantage. "Status report," Reynolds said. Lieutenant Vega tapped on her console, her fingers moving quickly. "Stealth system is stable. Energy levels holding. We're still invisible." Lieutenant Harris nodded. "The enemy fleet is confused. They're firing blindly into space." Reynolds smirked. "Let's keep it that way. Prepare the next strike." The crew worked swiftly, loading another set of torpedoes. Unlike standard human weapons, these had been modified to detonate inside enemy ships, bypassing traditional shields. They weren't powerful in size, but they were devastatingly precise. The Sparrow drifted closer to another enemy vessel, a heavy cruiser bristling with weapons. Its crew had no idea that death was creeping toward them, unseen and unstoppable. "Fire," Reynolds ordered. A single torpedo launched from the Sparrow, small and unremarkable. It silently slipped past the cruiser's defenses, entering through a maintenance port. A few seconds later, the ship detonated from within, its own power core turning into a fiery explosion. The Vornax fleet erupted into full panic. 2 ships down, and they still couldn't see their enemy. Inside the flagship, alarms blared as officers shouted over one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. Lord Zyros slammed his fist against the control panel, his patience finally snapping. "This is impossible," he roared. "Humans don't have this kind of technology. They should be weak." But they weren't weak. Not anymore. Another explosion rocked the fleet as a third Vornax ship was destroyed. The Sparrow moved like a phantom, striking with surgical precision before vanishing into the void. By now, the entire fleet was in disarray. Some captains panicked and fired wildly into space, hoping to hit something, anything. Others hesitated, too afraid to move, fearing they would be the next target. Reynolds watched from his command chair, his expression calm and controlled. He knew what was happening. Fear. The Vornax had never been afraid of humans before. They had always been the superior force, the stronger race. But now, for the first time, they were experiencing what it felt like to be hunted. He leaned forward. "Let's give them something to be truly afraid of." With a flick of his hand, he gave the next command. The Sparrow turned sharply, accelerating toward the heart of the enemy fleet. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. The weakest ship in the fleet had become something terrifying, and the Vornax had no idea how to stop it. The battlefield had turned into a nightmare for the Vornax. What should have been an easy slaughter had become something far worse, a slow, creeping horror that they could neither see nor understand. Their ships floated in tight formations, scanning the void for any trace of the missing human vessel. But the Sparrow remained a ghost, slipping through their defenses like a predator stalking its prey. On board the Sparrow, the crew worked in tense silence. Every move was calculated, every decision precise. The stealth system, powered by the Phantom Eye, was pushing its limits. If it failed, the ship would be exposed, and the entire fleet would descend upon them in an instant. But so far, the system held. Captain Reynolds stood at the command console, watching the enemy fleet unravel. They had already taken down 3 ships, and now the Vornax were afraid to move. Their confidence had shattered. They no longer attacked. They hesitated, and hesitation was deadly in war. Lieutenant Vega's voice broke the silence. "Captain, I'm detecting erratic movement in the enemy fleet. Their battle formations are collapsing." Reynolds allowed himself a small grin. "Good. That means they're scared." Lieutenant Harris frowned at his monitor. "They're still trying to find us, but they're not using their usual scanning methods anymore." He turned to the captain. "Sir, I think they're adapting." That caught Reynolds' attention. "Explain." Harris adjusted the display, highlighting strange readings. "They've stopped scanning for our energy signature. Now they're tracking space distortion, gravity shifts, residual heat. They're looking for the gaps in space where we should be." A flicker of amusement crossed Reynolds' face. "Smart." His tone shifted, but not smart enough. The Vornax might have started thinking outside their usual tactics, but it wouldn't save them. The Sparrow had more than just stealth, it had a plan. Reynolds turned to his crew. "It's time to step up the game. Vega, prepare the infiltration drones." A moment of silence passed before Vega spoke. "Sir, you want to deploy them now. We've never tested them in actual combat." Reynolds gave a knowing nod, which means the enemy hasn't seen them before either. "Let's keep it that way." Within the belly of the Sparrow, a hatch slowly opened, releasing 3 autonomous drones into the void. Unlike traditional combat drones, these weren't designed to fight directly. They were small, nearly invisible, and specialized in boarding enemy ships undetected. The drones moved like shadows, silent and unseen, latching onto the nearest Vornax warship, a heavily armored battlecruiser. Inside, the alien crew remained unaware as the drones crawled through the ventilation systems, avoiding security measures and sensor suites. Then, they reached the engine room. Back on the Sparrow, Harris monitored the feed from the drones. "They're in." Reynolds gave a single command: shut it down. The drones activated, hacking directly into the battlecruiser systems. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and then, complete silence. The massive ship went dark, floating lifelessly in space. The crew inside shouted in confusion, struggling to regain control. That's when the Sparrow struck. A well-placed torpedo fired from the shadows, hitting the disabled cruiser with devastating accuracy. The explosion sent debris scattering in all directions. The Vornax fleet watched in horror as one of their strongest ships was destroyed without ever firing a shot. The panic spread like wildfire. Captains screamed over the communication channels, demanding answers. Some ordered wild, desperate attacks in random directions, hoping to hit their invisible enemy. Others tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Lord Zyros stood frozen in his command chamber, his hands clenched into tight fists, claws digging into his palms. He had never felt fear in battle before, but now, for the first time, he understood what it was like to be prey. One of his officers turned to him, voice shaking. "Commander, we can't stop them." Zyros' crimson eyes burned with fury. "No," he growled. "We will not be hunted like animals." His mind raced. The humans were using something beyond their normal technology, something new. If they wanted to fight like ghosts, then he would burn the battlefield to the ground. He turned sharply to his crew. "Order all ships to charge their plasma cannons. Target the surrounding space. Full area bombardment. If we cannot see them, we will destroy everything around us." Across the fleet, Vornax warships powered up their deadliest weapons, massive plasma batteries capable of vaporizing entire sections of space. It didn't matter if they couldn't see their enemy. They would simply wipe out the battlefield itself. On the Sparrow, Harris paled as he read the new energy readings. "Captain, they're going to destroy everything." Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, his smirk returned. "Let them try." The Sparrow wasn't finished yet. It had one last trick up its sleeve. The void of space trembled with energy as the Vornax fleet prepared to unleash destruction on a scale never seen before. Plasma cannons hummed with raw power, their barrels glowing with an eerie blue light. The Vornax weren't hunting anymore. They weren't searching. They were purging the battlefield. On the Sparrow, tension filled the air. The crew watched as the enemy ships positioned themselves, ready to fire in all directions. They couldn't see their target, so they would burn everything until nothing remained. Lieutenant Harris' voice was tight with urgency. "Captain, they're charging up for a sector-wide bombardment. If they fire, we won't be able to dodge. They'll turn this whole area into a firestorm." Reynolds didn't react immediately. He simply studied the battlefield, his sharp eyes analyzing every detail. He had expected the Vornax to panic. But this was desperation. It meant they were afraid. And fear made people reckless. Lieutenant Vega clenched her fists. "We need to get out of here now. Phantom stealth won't protect us if they're just erasing everything in range." But Reynolds shook his head. "Running isn't an option. If we retreat, they'll know we can be scared away. They'll think they've won." His voice was calm, steady. "We're not leaving. We're finishing this." A moment of silence passed. Then he turned to Harris. "How long until they fire?" Harris checked the readings. "Less than 2 minutes." Reynolds nodded. "Good. That's enough time." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "Enough time for what?" Vega asked. Reynolds leaned forward. "We're going to make them destroy their own fleet." Harris blinked. "Sir." A smirk tugged at Reynolds' lips. "They're relying on their sensors to guide their bombardment, right? What if their own ships became the targets?" Vega's eyes widened as realization dawned. "We hacked their targeting systems." Reynolds nodded. "Exactly." Harris hesitated. "Captain, their systems are advanced. Even with our tech, we'd need to get inside their network to override their firing controls." Reynolds turned to Vega. How fast can you modify the infiltration drones? Vega's hands were already moving across her console. Give me 30 seconds. The ship's hidden hatch opened once more, and this time, the modified infiltration drones shot forward at full speed, weaving through the debris toward the Vornax warships. Their mission wasn't sabotage, it was deception. Inside the enemy fleet, the drones latched onto several ships, tapping into their targeting systems. They fed false data directly into the Vornax computers, making it look as if the Sparrow was everywhere except where it actually was. On the flagship, Lord Zyros watched the countdown reach its final seconds. His voice was filled with cold fury as he gave the final order. Fire. The void erupted. Massive plasma beams lanced through space, cutting across the battlefield with terrifying force. The sheer power of the bombardment ripped through anything in its path, creating waves of destruction that spread in all directions. But the Vornax hadn't fired at the Sparrow. They had fired at themselves. One by one, their own warships were annihilated by their own weapons. The plasma beams sliced through the fleet, tearing apart hulls, rupturing power cores, and sending shockwaves of destruction through the Armada. Inside the flagship, Lord Cyro's eyes widened in horror as his own ships were consumed by the devastation. This is impossible, he roared, slamming his fist against the command console. His officers scrambled to cut power to the weapons, but it was too late. The Vornax fleet had doomed itself. On the Sparrow, the crew watched in stunned silence as the enemy destroyed itself. Flames and debris filled the battlefield, and the once mighty Vornax armada was now a graveyard of shattered ships. Vega exhaled slowly. Captain, we just made them wipe out half their own fleet. Reynolds gave a small, satisfied nod. Told you we had enough time. But it wasn't over yet. A warning light flashed on the control panel. Harris quickly checked the readings and froze. Sir, the Vornax flagship is still intact, and they're locking onto us. Reynolds didn't flinch. Looks like Xyros is still standing. He turned to his crew, his eyes sharp and determined. Time to end this. The Sparrow turned, heading straight for the last enemy standing. The battle wasn't over, but the final fight was about to begin. The battlefield was a graveyard of shattered Vornax warships. Fires raged in the void, illuminating the wreckage of what had once been an unstoppable fleet. The echoes of destruction still lingered, but amidst the chaos, one ship remained untouched, the Vornax flagship. It loomed in the distance like a predator, its jagged black hull untouched by the carnage around it. Inside, Lord Zyros stood rigid, his claws digging into the metal railing as he watched the ruins of his armada drift through space. The silence on his bridge was deafening. His officers barely dared to breathe. The enemy had done the unthinkable. The Sparrow, the weakest human ship, had turned his own fleet against itself. It had made a mockery of the Vornax war doctrine, reducing an overwhelming force to scrap and ash. But Cyros was not defeated. Not yet. His blood-red eyes burned with fury as he turned to his weapons officer. Prepare the Omega cannon. The officer hesitated. But my lord, that weapon is unstable. Cyros slammed his fist against the console. I did not ask for your opinion. Charge the cannon. The officer swallowed hard and obeyed. Deep within the flagship, energy conduits flared to life. The Omega cannon was not a standard weapon. It was a prototype, a super weapon capable of wiping out entire fleets with a single shot. It had been deemed too dangerous to use in battle. But now, Cyros did not care. This was no longer about strategy. It was about revenge. The Sparrow remained hidden among the wreckage, observing the flagship's every move. On board, Captain Reynolds narrowed his eyes as he watched the energy build up on his display. Something was wrong. Vega's voice was sharp with alarm. Captain, that power signature. It's off the charts. Harris paled as he analyzed the readings. They're activating a super weapon. If that thing fires, we're done. Reynolds exhaled slowly. Not if we stop them first. Vega frowned. Captain, with that much energy, Phantom's stealth won't be enough to save us. Reynolds turned to his crew. His voice was calm but firm. We don't need to hide anymore. He pointed at the flagship on the display. We're going in. The Sparrow lurched forward, breaking free from the debris field. Its engines roared as it accelerated toward the last enemy standing. No more sneaking. No more waiting. It was time for the final strike. On the Vornax bridge, alarms blared as the Sparrow emerged from the shadows. One of the officers gasped, "My lord, the human ship is coming right at us." Cyros snarled, "Let them come." The Omega cannon was seconds from firing. The massive weapon extended from the flagship's hull, crackling with raw, unstable energy. If it fired, the Sparrow would be erased from existence. Reynolds gripped his seat. "Harris, prepare for emergency maneuvers. Vega, load the last payload. We're taking the shot." Vega's fingers flew across her console. Missiles locked on target. Harris' hands trembled. "Captain, if we don't time this right." Reynolds cut him off. "Then we're dead anyway. Fire on my mark." The Sparrow closed in, weaving through wreckage as the Omega cannon reached full charge. Inside the Vornax flagship, Tyros watched the energy meter reach its peak. His lips curled into a vicious grin. "This is the end," he whispered. The Omega cannon fired. A colossal beam of energy exploded from the flagship's core, tearing through space like the wrath of a god. It moved so fast, so violently, that even light itself seemed to bend around it. But the Sparrow was already moving. Harris threw the ship into a tight spiral, dodging the beam by the slimmest of margins. The raw energy scraped past them, sending shockwaves through the ship. Systems flickered, but they were still alive. Reynolds didn't hesitate. Fire. The Sparrow's torpedoes launched at full speed. They weren't ordinary explosives. These were EMP warheads, designed specifically for one thing: shutting down enemy power systems. The torpedoes struck the Vornax flagship dead center. The impact sent a violent pulse through the ship, crawling through its circuits like a virus. Inside, lights flickered, then died. The Omega cannon, still unstable from firing, overloaded. Tyros barely had time to scream before the entire power core detonated. The flagship erupted, the explosion so powerful it split the vessel in two. The shockwave rippled through space, sending debris flying in all directions. What had once been the deadliest ship in the Vornax fleet was now nothing but burning wreckage. The Sparrow soared past the explosion, battered but victorious. On the bridge, the crew let out gasps of relief. The enemy was gone. The battle was over. Vega let out a shaky laugh. "Captain, we did it." Harris exhaled, his hands still trembling. "I can't believe we're alive." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, watching the last remnants of the Vornax fleet drift into nothingness. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "The weakest ship in the fleet, huh?" He chuckled. "Not anymore." The Sparrow turned away from the wreckage and set course for home. The war was not over. The Vornax Empire still stood. But tonight, humanity had done the impossible. They had taken their weakest ship and turned it into the enemy's greatest fear. The battlefield was silent now. The wreckage of the Vornax fleet drifted through the void, the last embers of destruction fading into darkness. Where once there had been overwhelming enemy forces, now there was only debris, silent proof of the impossible victory. But the fight was not over. On the bridge of the Sparrow, the crew sat in stunned silence, their bodies still tense from the battle. The Vornax flagship was gone, obliterated by its own unstable power core. The Omega cannon had been their last, desperate weapon, and it had failed. Yet, something still felt wrong. Harris ran a scan of the wreckage, his fingers shaking from exhaustion. "Captain, I'm detecting anomalous signals." Reynolds frowned. "Explain." Harris' face paled as the readings came into focus. "Escape pods. At least 12 of them." A heavy silence settled over the bridge. Vega was the first to speak. That means Xyros could still be alive. The thought made Reynolds' jaw tighten. Lord Xyros, the mastermind behind the Vornax invasion, the warlord who had slaughtered countless human colonies, had escaped death. They hadn't won yet. Reynolds stood. Find the escape pods. Lock onto their trajectory. I want to know where they're headed. Harris worked quickly, tapping into the ship's long-range scanners. They're moving toward a hidden relay station near the asteroid belt. It's not showing up on any known maps. Vega narrowed her eyes. That's not just a relay station. That's a fallback point. If Kairos reaches it, he'll send out a distress call. Reynolds exhaled. And the Vornax reinforcements will come. They had just barely survived this fight. If another fleet arrived before they could escape, they would be overwhelmed. The Sparrow was tough, but it wasn't invincible. Harris hesitated. Captain, do we go after him? Reynolds didn't hesitate. We finish what we started. The Sparrow's engines roared to life once more, pushing the ship toward the asteroid belt. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about revenge. This was about ensuring the war didn't escalate further. If Kairos survived, he would spin this defeat into propaganda. He would return with an even larger fleet, one designed specifically to wipe humanity from existence. They had one chance to end him. As the Sparrow approached the asteroid belt, Vega pulled up the enemy's path. We've got visual on the relay station. It's small, lightly armed, but its communication systems are advanced. Harris tapped his screen. If Xyros reaches it, he only needs seconds to send an emergency beacon. Reynolds stared at the display. The escape pods were moving fast, slipping between the asteroids. They were running, but they weren't far enough ahead. He turned to Vega. What weapons do we have left? Vega frowned. We used most of our torpedoes in the battle. All we have left is one disruptor missile and a few standard rounds. Reynolds nodded. That's enough. He turned his gaze back to the asteroid belt. Let's end this. The Sparrow surged forward, dodging the floating debris as it closed in on the relay station. The escape pods were already docking, their airlocks opening. Any second now, Kairos would reach the control panel and send his call for reinforcements. Reynolds wouldn't let that happen. Harris, lock onto the relay station's power core. Vega, fire the disruptor missile. Vega didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved instinctively, launching the last missile straight at the heart of the station. The moment it struck, a wave of pure electromagnetic energy erupted, frying the station's systems. The lights flickered, then died. Inside the relay station, Lord Xyros stumbled as the control panel shut down completely. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and the emergency alarms blared. No, he roared, slamming his fist against the console. Get it back online. But the station's crew looked at him with fear. My lord, the system is dead. The signal won't go through. Xyros' claws clenched. Then prepare for. A shadow loomed over the station's viewport. The Sparrow was here. The docking clamps extended, latching onto the station's hull with a metallic snap. A moment later, a small boarding party breached the airlock. They weren't here to negotiate. Reynolds stepped onto the station's deck, his weapon raised. Behind him, Vega and two security officers followed, moving with precise, practiced steps. Xyros stood at the far end of the room, his eyes blazing with hatred and disbelief. You, he spat. Reynolds met his glare. Me. The warlord's claws flexed, but he was unarmed. His empire had fallen away piece by piece, and now he was alone. Reynolds took a slow step forward. It's over, Xyros. Xyros snarled. You think this is over, human? My kind will never stop hunting yours. His voice was full of venom, but it wavered slightly. For the first time, fear edged into it. Reynolds didn't blink. Then we'll make sure they know what happens when they cross us. Xyros lunged. Reynolds fired. The shot hit Xyros dead center, sending him crashing to the floor. The warlord gasped, clutching his wound as dark blood pooled beneath him. He struggled to speak, but no words came. And then, he was still. Vega lowered her weapon. The security officers stepped forward, scanning the area for threats, but there were none left. The warlord of the Vornax was dead. Reynolds let out a slow breath. It was finally over. The crew returned to the Sparrow, leaving the ruined relay station behind. As they took their seats on the bridge, Vega turned to Reynolds. "So, what now?" Reynolds watched the asteroid belt drift by on the view screen. The war wasn't over. Other enemies were still out there. But for now, just for now, they had won. He exhaled. Now, he leaned back in his chair. "We go home." The Sparrow turned away from the battlefield, its engines humming softly as it vanished into the vastness of space. The weakest ship in the fleet had become something more. It had faced death, defied the impossible, and emerged victorious. And as long as it flew, humanity would never be afraid again.